on the western edge of an old country, where the long green hills fall down into a sea that has never been entirely blue and has never been entirely grey, there is a small village that was, in the records of the country's earliest settlements, named Caerbrennig. The village is built in a narrow cleft between two high cliffs, where a small river runs down to the sea. The houses are made of stone, the roofs are slate, the smoke from the evening hearths rises and is taken almost immediately by the wind that moves down the river valley from the high inland country. There are perhaps 80 households in the village. There has not been more than that, for as long as anyone in the village can remember. The village has, in the years since its founding, kept itself quiet. It is not on any of the roads that travelers from the larger world commonly use. It has no notable industries. It produces no goods that are traded into the wider markets. The fishing boats of the village stay close to the cliffs, harvesting the small fish and the shellfish that live in the rocks of the harbour. The few crops that grow in the steep, narrow fields above the village are grown for the village itself rather than for export. The young people of the village, when they come of age, sometimes leave for the larger world. The old people of the village, almost without exception, stay. The village has, in this way, remained much as it was when its first stones were laid. The lives of its inhabitants have continued, generation after generation, in the slow rhythms that small coastal places have always kept. The village also has, on the cliff above its northern edge, a path. The path runs from a small wooden gate at the upper end of the village, along the top of the cliff, and out toward a high promontory that juts into the sea perhaps a mile from the village's nearest house. The path is narrow. The earth of it is dark. The grass that grows along its edges is the kind of coarse salt grass that grows in places where the wind from the sea is constant. The path is bordered, on its seaside, by a steep drop of perhaps 300 feet to the rocks below. On its inland side, the path is bordered by a low stone wall that has been standing, by all the accounts of the village, for longer than any of the houses of the village have been standing. The path is called, by the people of the village, the Salt Path. The path has had, for as long as the records of the village have recorded such things, a walker. The walker is, at any given time, one person. The person is always a woman. The person walks the path every evening, from the small wooden gate at the upper end of the village, out along the cliff, to the high promontory and back. The walking begins, in summer, perhaps an hour before sunset. In winter, when the day is short, it begins at the moment the light first begins to fail. The walking continues until full dark, after which the walker returns to the village by the same path and goes home. The walker, in the late summer of the year that this story takes place, was a woman named Aylwyn Price. She was 74 years old. She had been, by the count of the village's careful older residents, the walker of the Salt Path for 47 of those years. She had become the walker in her 27th year, when the previous walker, an old woman named Megan Trevin, had finally become too frail to walk the path and had passed the duty on. Aylwyn had been chosen by Megan in the way that the walkers had always been chosen by their predecessors. The choice had been quiet. There had been no formal announcement. Aylwyn had been told, on a particular morning in the autumn of her 26th year, that she would be the next walker, and Megan had begun to teach her the particulars of the walking in the months that followed, until the previous spring of Aylwyn's 27th year, when Megan had walked the path for the last time, and Aylwyn had begun, alone, to walk it every evening since. The villagers, in the long years of Aylwyn's walking, had developed the same patterns of behavior toward her that the villagers of every previous generation had developed toward each successive walker. They greeted her in the morning when they passed her in the village. They allowed her to make her small daily purchases at the village shop without comment. They did not, in any conversation, mention the walking. They did not, in any conversation, ask her about it. They did not, in any conversation, even allude to it. The walking was, in the way that small village customs sometimes are, a thing that was simply not discussed. Children of the village were taught, almost from the moment they could walk on their own, that the salt path was forbidden. They were not told why. They were told, in the simple, direct language that children's safety warnings often use, that the path was dangerous, that bad things happened to people who walked the salt path who were not the walker, that if they ever found themselves near the small wooden gate at the upper end of the village, especially at dusk, they were to turn around and go home without looking up the path. The children of the village absorbed this lesson with the seriousness that small children absorb the warnings of their adult world. They did not walk the salt path. They did not look at it for too long when they passed near its lower gate. They grew up understanding that there were some places that were not for ordinary people, that the village had elders who handled the things that needed to be handled in those places, and that the appropriate response of an ordinary villager to the salt path was simply to stay away from it. This was the situation of Caerbrennig and its salt path in the late summer of the year that a young man arrived in the village from the larger world. The young man's name was Tomos Caro. He was 22 years old. He had been born in a town in the inland country, some distance from Caerbrennig, but his mother's family had come from the village, and he had spent every childhood summer of his life staying with his maternal grandparents in the small stone house at the lower end of the village. His grandparents had both died in the previous several years, the grandmother first, the grandfather most recently, in the spring of the year of this story. Tomos had inherited, through his mother, a small share of the stone house, which she now intended to keep as a holiday property for the family. Tomos had come to the village in the late summer of that year in order to spend several weeks setting the house in order after his grandfather's death. There were possessions to be sorted. There were small repairs to be made. There were the kind of practical tasks that the death of the last living occupant of an old house typically produces. Tomos, who had recently completed a degree at one of the inland universities, and who did not yet have a clear sense of what kind of work he wanted to do as an adult, had volunteered to come and spend the time that the work would require. He arrived in Caerbrennig on a quiet afternoon in early August. He came up the long, winding road from the inland country in the small car his mother had lent him for the trip, and he descended the steep final approach into the village in the late afternoon. He parked the car in the small space behind his grandparents' house, where the family cars had been parked for as long as he could remember. He carried his bags inside. He opened the windows to let the salt air into the rooms that had been closed for several months. He made himself a small meal from the provisions he had brought from the larger town inland. He went to bed early, as the long drive had tired him, and he intended to begin his work the following morning. He woke, in the early morning of his second day, to the soft grey light of a coastal dawn coming through the small window of the bedroom that had been his during his summer visits as a child. He lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the sound of the sea, which was, in the deep quiet of the early morning, the only sound the village produced at that hour. He got up. He made tea in the small kitchen. He went out into the village. He walked in the cool air of the morning, the familiar paths of his childhood. He went down to the small harbour. He looked at the fishing boats that had not yet gone out. He went up to the village shop, which had not yet opened. He went to the small stone bridge that crossed the river at the centre of the village. He stood on the bridge for some time, looking at the water moving below. He felt, in the quiet of that morning, the strange combination of feelings that returning to a place of one's childhood after a long absence produces. The feeling that everything was the same. The feeling that everything was different. The feeling that he was, somehow, both the child he had been when he had last visited the village and the young adult who had now returned to it, occupying the same body, walking the same paths, breathing the same air, but no longer the same person who had done these things in the summers of his earlier life. It was while he was standing on the bridge, in the cool grey light of that morning, that he saw the old woman. She came down the small path that led from the upper end of the village. She was small. She was wearing a long dark grey dress that came almost to the ground. Her hair was the color of old snow. She was carrying in her right hand a small canvas sharping bag. She crossed the bridge perhaps 15 feet from where Tomos was standing. She did not, as she crossed, look in his direction. She walked at a slow, steady pace that suggested she was familiar with the bridge and with the morning routine her walking was clearly part of. Her face, which Tomos saw briefly as she passed, was the face of a very old woman who had lived a very particular life. There were many lines in it. The eyes were a pale grey blue. The expression was neutral and contained, the expression of a person who was attending to something other than her surroundings. Tomos felt, as the old woman passed him on the bridge, a small immediate sense of recognition that he could not at first place. He was certain that he had seen this woman before. He could not, in the first moments of the encounter, remember when. The recognition arrived several minutes later, after the old woman had continued on toward the village shop, which was just then beginning to open for the morning. He had seen her, in his summers as a child, walking the path along the cliff at dusk. He remembered now that he had often, during those summers, seen her from a distance, as the family had returned from the small beach below the harbor, climbing the village main path in the early evening. The old woman, in his memories, had been visible against the darkening sky, walking the long line of the cliff path, alone, in the slow, steady rhythm that he had now seen up close on the bridge. He had asked his grandmother, on one of those evenings in his childhood, who the old woman was. His grandmother, he remembered now, had paused before answering. She had said, in the careful voice that adults sometimes used when they were giving children answers that they did not want to elaborate on, that the old woman's name was Aylwin, and that she walked the cliff path every evening, and that this was something the people of the village did not talk about. His grandmother had not, when Tomos had pressed her on why people did not talk about it, given any further explanation. She had simply said that some things in the village were not for explaining to children, and that Tomos would understand when he was older, and that he should not, in the meantime, walk the cliff path himself. Tomos had not, in his summers as a child, ever walked the cliff path. He had, like all the children of his summer visits, absorbed the warning and stayed away from it. The walking of Aylwin Price had been for him simply one of the strange particular features of the village, no more remarkable in the structure of his childhood understanding than the fact that the village shop closed for 2 hours in the middle of every day, or that the fishing boats always went out before dawn. Standing on the bridge that morning, however, watching the old woman walk away toward the village shop, Tomos found himself, for the first time in his life, actively curious about what the salt path was for. He was, after all, 22 years old. He had completed a degree. He had read a great deal. He was no longer the child who had accepted without examination the small mysterious customs of his summer village. He was an adult, returning to the village for an extended period of time. He was, perhaps for the first time in his life, in a position to understand the village as an adult understood it, rather than as a child experienced it. He decided, that morning, that he would, before his time in the village ended, find out what the salt path was for. He did not, that morning, take any particular action toward this goal. He went home. He had a second cup of tea. He began the work he had come to do, which involved sorting through the contents of the small front room of his grandparents' house. He spent the day in this work, and the evening alone in the house, and he went to bed without giving the question of the salt path any further explicit thought. But the question stayed with him in the days that followed, as Tomos continued his work in the house, and as he reacquainted himself, slowly, with the patterns of village life. He began to notice the salt path in a way he had not noticed it before. He became aware of when, in the late afternoon, the old woman left her own small house at the upper end of the village. He became aware of the route she took to the small wooden gate at the start of the path. He became aware of the time, in the early evening, when she returned. He became aware of the way the other villagers, in the hours of her walking, kept their attention away from the cliff. He became aware of the small social structure that surrounded the salt path, the careful avoidance, the unspoken consensus that the path and its walker were not to be discussed. He became aware also that he himself, as a member of the village by the inheritance of his grandparents' house, was now expected to participate in the same avoidance. The villagers, who knew him from his childhood visits and who greeted him warmly when they encountered him at the shop or on the small streets, had begun, in the second week of his stay, to absorb him into the village's normal patterns, including the pattern of not discussing the salt path. Tomos found, in himself, a stubbornness that he had not previously recognized. He decided, in the third week of his stay, that he was not going to participate in the avoidance. He was going to ask the questions that the village did not ask. He was going to find someone in the village who would tell him what the salt path was for, what Aylwin Price was actually doing on it, and why the duty had been carried, year after year, generation after generation, by a single woman walking out toward the high promontory at dusk. He did not know, when he made this decision, that the act of asking the questions would, in the slow, careful way that small villages have of dealing with outsiders who ask questions they are not supposed to ask, change the course of his life. He would find out. The first person Tomos approached, in his decision to ask the questions the village did not ask, was an elderly fisherman named Ilo Brennig, who had been a friend of his grandfather's for many decades. Ilo Brennig was, in the late summer of that year, perhaps 80 years old. He still went out in his small boat most mornings, although the village's younger fishermen had begun, in recent years, to handle the heavier work that the boat required. He lived alone in a small house near the harbor. He had been, by his grandfather's accounts, a thoughtful and curious man for the entirety of his long life. If anyone in the village would talk to Tomos about the salt path, Tomos believed it would be Ilo. Tomos approached him on a warm afternoon in the third week of his stay. Ilo was sitting on the small wooden bench outside his house, mending a fishing net in the slow, careful way that old fishermen mend nets. He greeted Tomos with the small pleased nod he always gave when Tomos passed his bench on his way down to the harbor. Tomos sat down on the bench beside him. For some minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. About the weather, about the progress of Tomos's work in the house, about the small, ordinary news of the village. Then Tomos asked his question. He asked Ilo, in the careful, direct way he had been planning the conversation in the days before, why the salt path had a walker. Ilo did not, at the question, immediately respond. He continued, for a long moment, with his work on the net. He did not look up at Tomos. He did not show, in any visible feature of his face, what he was thinking. After a long pause, he set down the net. He looked at the harbor, where his small boat was tied to the stone pier. He looked at the cliff above the village, which was, in the bright afternoon light, plainly visible from where they sat. He looked, finally, at Tomos. He said, in a voice that was quieter than the voice he had been using earlier in the conversation, that this was not a question Tomos was supposed to ask. He said that the people of Kebrenig did not ask this question. They did not ask it of each other. They did not ask it of the walker. They did not ask it of themselves. Tomos said that he understood that, but that he had decided, as a returning adult member of the village, that he wanted to understand. He said that he was not going to ask anyone else if Ilo did not want to discuss it. He said that he was asking Ilo because he respected him and trusted him. Ilo was silent for some minutes after Tomos said this. He looked again at the harbor and at the cliff and at the small streets of the village around them. He said, finally, that he would tell Tomos what he knew. He would tell him because he had been a friend of Tomos's grandfather, and because Tomos's grandfather had once asked him the same question many years before, when Tomos's grandfather had been a young man newly married into a family of the village. Ilo had told Tomos's grandfather then. He would tell Tomos now. But Ilo said, Tomos must understand several things before he heard what Ilo would tell him. The first thing was that what Ilo would tell him was not, in any sense, a folk tale. It was not a story the village told for entertainment. It was the actual practical understanding of what the village had been doing in the form of the salt pathwalker for as long as the village had existed. The second thing was that, once Tomos heard what Ilo would tell him, he could not pretend he had not heard it. He would carry the knowledge for the rest of his life. He would have to live with it. The third thing was that, once Tomos heard what Ilo would tell him, he must, like all the other adults of the village, never speak of it to anyone who had not asked, with the same kind of seriousness with which Tomos was now asking to be told. Tomos said that he understood. He said that he accepted the conditions. Ilo nodded slowly. He picked up his net again. He worked on it for a few more minutes, in the slow, careful way he had been working on it before. He spoke, while he worked, in the same quiet voice he had been using since Tomos had asked his question. He told Tomos that the salt path, on the cliff above the village, was an old path. It had been walked by women of the village since before the village itself had been founded in any organized way. The original walkers had been, in the dim memory of the village's earliest oral traditions, women of a particular family who had lived in the region before the small fishing settlement that would become Caer Brenig had been established. The walking had continued, in unbroken succession, since that first time. The current walker, Aylwin Price, was perhaps the 80th or 90th walker in a line that went back, in the village's reckoning, more than 1,000 years. The path was walked, Ilo said, in order to meet something that came up the cliff from the sea at dusk. The thing that came up the cliff was not, Ilo said, easy to describe. It was not, in the strict sense, a creature. It was something older. It was something that had lived, for as long as the sea had been the sea, in the deep waters off the coast where the village now stood. It came up the cliff once a day, at dusk, in the way that creatures of the sea come up onto the rocks at low tide. It did not come for any reason that the people of the village had ever fully understood. It came simply because that was what it did. The thing that came up the cliff at dusk needed, Ilo said, to be met. The need was not, in any obvious sense, a need that the village had imposed on the thing. It was a need that the thing had, in some way, expressed long ago, at the time the original walking had begun. The thing did not, in the present day, communicate with the walker in any directly verbal way, but the meeting itself, the simple act of a person walking out along the cliff at dusk and being present at the high promontory when the thing came up out of the sea, was something the thing required. As long as the meeting happened, the thing came up, looked at the walker, communicated with her in whatever silent way it communicated, and went back down into the sea. As long as this pattern continued, the village was safe. If the meeting did not happen, Ilo said, the thing would come further. It would come up onto the cliff itself. It would come into the village. It would bring with it certain consequences that the village had, in the long centuries of its existence, only had to learn about on 3 separate occasions, all of which were preserved in the village's careful oral traditions. Each of those occasions had ended, eventually, in the resumption of the walking, by a new walker who had been quickly chosen. But the periods between the breaking of the walking and the resumption of it had been, in each case, periods of great difficulty for the village. People had died. Children had been lost. The fishing boats had failed to return. The small ordinary patterns of life had broken in ways that had taken many years to repair. The walker, Ilo said, was therefore not a curiosity. She was the central practical fact of the village's continued existence, the village's tolerance for the loss of life and the loss of small things that the breaking of the walking would produce was not, in any sense, available to be tested. The walker had to walk. The meeting had to happen. The thing had to be sent back down. This was the work that the salt pathwalker did every evening of every year for the entire duration of her tenure as the walker. This was the work that Aylwin Price had been doing every evening for the past 47 years. This was the work that the women of the village had been doing in unbroken succession for the entirety of the village's existence. Tomos sat on the bench beside Ilo for a long time after Ilo finished speaking. He did not, at first, know what to say. The information he had just received was so different in kind from what he had expected when he had asked his question that he did not yet have a frame in which to consider it. He had expected, when he had decided to ask, some kind of folk tale, some kind of historical superstition that the village had preserved for traditional reasons, and that no one in the village still actually believed. He had not expected to be told that the village was, in the present day in fact, defending itself against an actual creature that came up the cliff every evening from the actual sea. He asked Ilo, eventually, several follow-up questions. He asked whether anyone, in the long history of the walking, had ever seen the thing. Ilo said that the walker saw it every evening at the end of the path. The walker did not, ordinarily, describe what she saw to anyone else in the village. The descriptions that the village had collected over the centuries came from rare moments when very old walkers, near the end of their lives, had spoken to the new walkers about what to expect. The descriptions were partial and difficult to interpret. The thing, Ilo said, was very large. The thing came up out of the water along the rocks below the high promontory in a movement that was difficult to describe in human language. The thing had eyes of a sort. The thing had something that resembled a face. The walker stood at the end of the path and looked at the thing looked at her, and the looking continued until full dark, and then the thing went back down. Tomos asked what the walker was exactly supposed to do during this looking. Ilo said that the walker was supposed to be present. That was all. The walker was not supposed to attempt to communicate with the thing. The walker was not supposed to attempt to understand it. The walker was simply supposed to stand at the end of the path in full attention to the thing that was looking at her for as long as the looking continued. The walking out and the walking back were, in some way, the same as the looking. The walker had to walk to the place. The walker had to stay there until the meeting was complete. The walker had to walk back. The whole walking was the duty. Tomos asked what would happen, eventually, when Aylwin Price became too old to walk the path. Ilo said that, when that time came, Aylwin would choose her successor. The successor would be a young woman of the village, chosen by Aylwin in the same way that Aylwin had been chosen by Megan Trevin, and Megan had been chosen by the walker before her, and so on back through the centuries. The choosing was not done by any committee. It was not done by any vote. It was done simply by the current walker who knew by some understanding the village did not require her to explain who the next walker should be. The chosen woman, when she was approached by Aylwin, would be told what the duty was. She would be given the choice of accepting it. Refusal was, in the strictest sense, possible. There were stories, in the village older oral traditions, of women who had been chosen and who had refused. In each of those stories, the refusal had been honored, and a different woman had been chosen, and the walking had continued. Tomos asked, finally, what would happen if no woman of the village ever again accepted the duty? If at some point in the future the chain of walkers was broken not by accident, but by the simple unwillingness of the available candidates to take on the work. Ilo, when Tomos asked this question, looked up from his net for the first time in many minutes. He looked at Tomos with an expression that was, for a moment, unreadable. He said quietly that this was the only question Tomos had asked that the village did not have an answer to. The village had, in its long history, never had to consider the possibility seriously. There had always been, in each generation, a woman who accepted. There had been, in each generation, the kind of woman who understood, when the offer was made to her, what it meant, and who chose to accept it for the same reasons that the women before her had chosen to accept it. The village had not, in its accumulated wisdom, developed any plan for what it would do if such a woman did not, in some future generation, exist. Ilo said that he had wondered, in the long, quiet hours of his old age, whether such a generation might eventually come, whether the world outside the village, with its different expectations of women's lives, with its different ideas about duty and inheritance, and the kinds of work people should be willing to do, would eventually produce a generation of village women who would, when they were chosen, decline. He said that he did not know what would happen if that generation came. He said that he was glad, in some private way, that he would not be alive to find out. Tomo sat with Ilo for some time longer that afternoon, but they did not, for the rest of the conversation, return to the subject of the walking. They spoke about other things, about Ilo's recent fishing, about the small, ordinary news of the harbour, about a repair Tomos was planning to make to the back wall of his grandparents' house in the following week. Tomos thanked Ilo when he finally stood up to leave for what Ilo had told him. Ilo nodded. He returned to his work on the net. He said nothing further as Tomos walked away. Tomos returned to his grandparents' house. He spent the rest of the afternoon attempting to do the work he had been doing earlier in the day, but he found that he could not, with any consistency, focus on it. His mind kept returning to what Ilo had told him, to the picture of the high promontory above the cliff, to the picture of Aylwin Price standing at the end of the path in the failing light of the evening, to the picture of the thing in the sea coming up the rocks, looking at her with whatever it had that resembled eyes. That evening, for the first time since his arrival in the village, Tomos went out at dusk and stood at the edge of the village, near the small wooden gate at the bottom of the salt path, and watched. He did not, of course, walk the path. He had been told too clearly, in his childhood, and now in his adult conversation with Ilo, that the path was forbidden to him. But he could see, from the small wooden gate, the long line of the path running out along the cliff. He could see, in the dim grey-blue light of the late summer evening, the small figure of Aylwin Price walking out along it. He watched her walk. He watched her become smaller in the distance as she moved toward the high promontory. He watched her arrive eventually at the end of the path, where the cliff turned and the promontory rose in its great mass against the sea. He watched her stand there, for what seemed, in the quiet of the village evening, like a very long time. He could not, from the distance, see what she was looking at. He could not see whether anything was, in fact, coming up the rocks. He could see only the small still figure of the old woman, standing at the end of the path, in the deepening grey of the evening, doing the work that the village had been doing, in some form, for more than 1,000 years. When she finally turned and began to walk back, the light was almost entirely gone. Tomos went home before she reached the village. He did not want her to see him watching. He felt, after what Ilo had told him, that the watching itself was a kind of small intrusion that he did not have the right to. But he had seen, in the brief minutes of his watching, something that he understood, even without being able to articulate it clearly, was important. He had seen the actual practical execution of the duty that Ilo had described. He had seen the work being done. He had seen, in the small, still figure on the high promontory, the visible embodiment of the boundary that the village kept against the thing that came up from the sea. He went to bed early that night. He slept badly. He dreamed, in the deep hours, of a sea that was darker than any sea he had ever seen, and of something rising in it. In the days that followed Tomos's conversation with Ilo, he completed the work he had come to the village to do. He sorted through his grandparents' possessions. He repaired the back wall of the house. He arranged for the small things that his mother had wanted shipped back to the inland town to be packed and sent. He prepared the house, in the careful way that the work required. For the long, quiet years, it would now spend as the family's holiday property, occupied for a few weeks each summer and otherwise empty. In the evenings, in the last several weeks of his stay, he continued his small private practice of standing at the edge of the village near the bottom of the salt path and watching Aylwin Price walk out and back. He did not, in any of those evenings, see anything more than what he had seen on the first evening, the small still figure walking out along the cliff, the standing at the high promontory, the walking back, the work repeated every evening with the same patient regularity that the work had been performed for more than 1,000 years. He did not, in those weeks, attempt to speak with Aylwin herself. He had decided, after his conversation with Ilo, that he would not. Aylwin was, in some sense, Tomos was beginning to understand. Not a person he was permitted to interrupt with curious questions. She was carrying a duty. The duty required, among other things, that she be left alone in the carrying of it. The village's quiet refusal to discuss her work was not, Tomos now understood, simply a tradition. It was a small ongoing courtesy that the village was paying to the woman who was, by her work, keeping it safe. Tomos left the village in the second week of October. He drove the long, winding road back to the inland country with the feeling that he was leaving behind something he did not entirely understand and that he was not ready yet to put aside. In the months that followed his return to the inland town, Tomos thought about Kerbrenig more often than he had expected to. He had returned, in the village, only briefly. The work he had done there had been small and practical. The conversation he had had with Iolo, while extraordinary, had been only one conversation. By any external measure, the time he had spent in the village had been a small interval in a long life. But the time had marked him in some way that he could not entirely name. He thought often about the salt path, about Aylwyn Price, about the line of women going back through the centuries who had walked the path before her, about the careful, patient duty they had been carrying on behalf of a village that did not, in its ordinary daily life, even acknowledge the duty existed. He thought also about the question Iolo had wondered about in the quiet hours of his old age, the question of what would happen if a generation came in which no woman of the village would accept the duty. He thought about this question often. He thought about it with a kind of personal urgency that he could not, at first, fully account for. In the spring of the year following his stay in the village, when Tomos was 23 years old, he received a letter. The letter was from his mother. She had been told, she said, by an old friend in Kerbrenig that Aylwyn Price had become ill in the previous winter, that the illness had not been life-threatening, but that Aylwyn, who was now 75, had decided that the time had come for her to begin the process of preparing the village for her eventual successor. She had not, the letter said, yet chosen the successor, but she had, in conversations with several of the older women of the village, indicated that she would do so within the following year. Tomos read the letter twice. He set it down on the table. He sat for a long time looking out the window of his small apartment in the inland town. He thought, for the first time consciously, about the possibility that he had been thinking about, without quite acknowledging he had been thinking about it, since his return from the village. The thought was not, in its first appearance, fully formed. It was a kind of restlessness, a kind of feeling that the life he was currently living in the inland town was not the life he was supposed to be living. A feeling that something in Kerbrenig was waiting for him. He understood at the same time that the thought was, in any of its possible practical forms, slightly absurd. He was not a woman of the village. He could not, by any of the customs Iolo had described, be the next walker. The walker had always been a woman. The walker had always been, in some sense, descended from the original walkers of the family that had begun the duty. Tomos was, in this technical sense, not a candidate for the role. But he was, by his mother, a descendant of one of the village's older families. He had, by his summers in the village, a real, if limited, connection to the place. He was, in the long perspective Iolo had given him, a person who had been told what the duty was and who had not, since being told, been able to put the knowledge aside. He decided, in the late spring of that year, to return to the village. He gave notice at the temporary job he had been working since his graduation. He told his mother that he was going to spend a longer period at the house in Kerbrenig than he had originally planned. He did not, in his explanation to her, fully describe what he was going to be doing. He said only that the time at the house had clarified for him certain things about his life, and that he wanted to spend more time there before deciding what kind of work he wanted to pursue as an adult. His mother, who had been worrying, in the months since his return, about his apparent lack of clear direction, was relieved by the suggestion that he had a plan. She offered to help him with the practical arrangements. He accepted the offer. He arrived back in Cerbrenig in early June. He moved into his grandparents' house. He began, with the slow, careful pace of a person who did not have any external schedule, to integrate himself into the ordinary daily life of the village. He attended the small village events that were open to occasional residents. He helped Ilo with his fishing on the mornings when Ilo could use an additional pair of hands. He repaired, slowly, the small accumulating things in the house that needed repair. He began, in short, to be not a visitor, but a resident, for as long as he could maintain the arrangement. He approached Aylwin Price in late August, 3 months after his arrival. He had been thinking, during the 3 months, about how he would approach her. He had concluded that the approach would have to be honest. He could not, with any reasonable hope of success, manufacture a pretext for the conversation. The conversation would have to be what it was. He would have to tell her what he had come to say. He would have to accept whatever response she gave him. He approached her on a quiet morning in the village shop, when she was making her usual small daily purchases. He waited until she was finished. He followed her, at a respectful distance, until she had walked the few small streets back to her house at the upper end of the village. He stopped her at the small gate of her front garden. He introduced himself, in the careful, direct way he had been planning the introduction. He told her his name. He told her that he was the grandson of Llewellyn Carrow, whom Aylwin had known. He told her that he had been told, by Ilo Brenig, what the salt path was for. He told her that he had come back to the village in the spring with the intention of finding her, and that he wanted to ask her something. Aylwin Price stood at the gate of her small garden for a long moment, looking at him with her pale grey-blue eyes. She did not, when he finished speaking, respond immediately. She studied him. The studying continued for what seemed to Tomos like a very long time. After what was perhaps a full minute, she said, in a soft voice that was much softer than her age would have suggested, that he should come into the house with her. They had things to discuss. The conversation that followed, in the small front room of Aylwin's house that morning, was a conversation that Tomos would think about in different ways for the rest of his life. He told her, in detail, what he had come to ask. He told her that he understood that the walker had always been a woman. He told her that he understood that he was not, by any of the customary criteria, a candidate for the duty. He told her that he had come, anyway, to offer himself. He told her that he had thought about the offer carefully in the months since his return to the inland town the previous year. He had thought about it as a young man considering a kind of vocation. He had thought about whether he was, in some real way, capable of the kind of work the duty required. He had concluded, after long consideration, that he wanted to try. He said, finally, that he understood that the choice of successor was Aylwin's alone. He said that he was not asking her to choose him. He was asking her only to consider whether he might be a candidate. He said that he understood the answer might be no. He said that, if the answer was no, he would accept it, and would not ask again, and would not, in any way, attempt to interfere with the choice she eventually made. Aylwin listened to all of this without interrupting. She did not, throughout his speech, change the expression of her face significantly. She continued to study him, in the careful, slow way she had been studying him since he had spoken to her at the gate. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Eventually, she said, in the same soft voice she had used at the gate, that she had been waiting for him for several months. She had known, she said, in some way she could not fully explain, that someone was coming who would offer themselves for the work. She had not known who. She had not known whether the someone would be a young woman of the village, as had always been the case in the past, or whether it would be, for the first time in the village's long history, someone different. She had been preparing herself, in the conversations she had been having with the older women of the village, for the possibility that the choosing might, this time, look different from how it had always looked before. She said that she had been considering, in particular, the question Ilo had wondered about in his old age. The question of what would happen if a generation came in which the duty could not be passed in the customary way. She had thought about this question more, perhaps, than any of the women of the village had thought about it. She had wondered, in the long evenings of her own walking, whether the duty was actually constrained by the customs the village had built up around it, or whether the duty itself was, in some sense, larger than those customs and would, when the time came, find a way to continue regardless of who was carrying it. Tomos's appearance at her gate that morning had, she said, given her at least a partial answer to this question. She would not that morning give him a final answer. She would need, she said, to walk the path several more times before she would know. She would need to consider, in the silent way the walking allowed her to consider things, whether what Tomos was offering was actually the kind of offer the duty could accept. She would tell him, before the autumn ended, what she had concluded. Tomos thanked her. He said that he would wait. He left her house that morning with a feeling that was, in its strange combination, both heavier and lighter than he had expected to feel. Heavier, because the conversation had made the offer he had come to make real, in a way that it had not been real before. Lighter, because he had, for the first time since his thinking on the matter had begun the previous year, put the offer into words, and had had the words received by the only person whose reception of them mattered. In the months that followed, Tomos lived in his grandparents' house and waited. Aylwin walked the path each evening, as she had walked it for 47 years. She did not, when she encountered Tomos in the village in the afternoons, say anything to him about the matter they had discussed. She continued the small, ordinary conversations they had begun to have. The conversations were, in their visible features, the conversations of any old woman of the village, with a young man of one of the village's families. But Tomos was aware, in those conversations, that something was being decided. He was aware, in the long minutes of Aylwin's walking each evening, that the decision was being arrived at. He was aware that he, by his presence in the village, and by his offer, was now part of the long, quiet process by which the duty was being passed from one generation to the next. The decision came in mid-October. Aylwin approached Tomos one morning at the village shop. She did not, in front of the other people in the shop, say anything significant to him. She simply asked him, in a soft voice, whether he might come to her house that afternoon. She said that she had something to tell him. He came that afternoon. He sat with her in the same small front room where they had first spoken in August. She told him, in the same soft voice she had used in their first conversation, that she had decided. She had decided to choose him. She had concluded, in the long evenings of her recent walking, that the duty would accept him. She had concluded also that he was the right person for the duty in this generation, in a way that no young woman of the village currently was. She said that the village would, in all likelihood, be confused by her choice. The village would, in some quarters, object. The village's customs would not, in any obvious way, permit the choice she had made. But the duty, she said, was not the village. The duty was older than the village. The duty had its own logic. The duty had told her, in the silent way it told her things, that he was the one. She said that she would teach him, over the autumn and winter, what he needed to know. She said that, in the spring, she would walk the path with him for the first time. They would walk it together at first, until he was ready. Then she would walk it with him less often. Then she would walk it with him no more, and he would walk it alone. She did not know, she said, how many years she had remaining. She would walk with him in the teaching for as long as she was able. After that, the duty would be his. Tomos stayed in the village from that autumn forward. He walked the path, beginning in the spring of his 24th year, first with Aylwin, then alone. The village, as Aylwin had predicted, was confused by the change. There were objections in the early months. There were villagers who would not, for some time, speak to Aylwin or to Tomos. There were old women who said, in the small, careful conversations of the village, that the duty had been broken, that the walker had always been a woman, that the meeting with the thing in the sea would not, this time, hold. But the meeting did hold. Tomos walked the path. He stood at the high promontory in the failing light. He met what came up from the sea. He saw, in time, what the walkers before him had seen. He communicated with it, in whatever silent way was required, until full dark, and then walked back to the village. The thing went back down, as the thing had always gone back down after the meeting. The village's confusion in the years that followed gradually subsided. The villagers, in the slow, practical way of small communities, came to accept the new arrangement. A new generation of children grew up in the village, understanding that the Salt Path Walker was, in this generation, a man. The strangeness of this fact, which had initially been the central feature of the village discussion of the new arrangement, became, in time, simply one of the small particular features of the village, no more remarkable than any of the other features the village had developed over its long history. Aylwin Price died in the spring of Tomos's 27th year, 3 years after he had taken on the duty. She had, in those 3 years, gradually reduced her own walking to occasional accompaniment, then to none at all. She had spent the last year of her life in her small house at the upper end of the village, attended by the older women of the village who had, despite their initial objections to Tomos, never withdrawn their care from her. She died on a quiet morning in early March, in her own bed, in the same room where she had lived for many decades. She was buried in the small churchyard at the center of the village, beside the graves of the walkers who had preceded her. Tomos continued to walk the salt path for many decades. He walked it through his 30s. He walked it through his 40s. He walked it through the slow, gradual aging of his own life, as the village around him also aged, as the children he had known when he had first arrived, as the new walker grew into adults, and then into older adults, as the older villagers of his early years died and were buried and were in time mostly forgotten. He found his successor, eventually, in the autumn of his 63rd year. The successor was, in some satisfaction of the village's older customs, a young woman. Her name was Mary Brennig, the great-granddaughter of Ilo Brennig, who had told Tomos, in his first summer, what the salt path was for. Mary was 22 years old when Tomos approached her, the same age Tomos had been when he had first asked Ilo his question. She listened to what Tomos told her with the same combination of dread and curiosity that Tomos remembered from his own listening, decades earlier, to Ilo. She accepted the duty in the spring following the offer. She walked with Tomos for several years. She continued, after his eventual departure, alone. Tomos walked across the salt path one final morning in the spring of his 71st year. He walked, that morning, in the direction the walkers had always walked when their work was finished, out toward the high promontory, beyond the high promontory, into whatever country waited for the walkers when they were done. The village did not, in any of its records, write down what happened to him after that morning. The village, in the way it had handled the long, quiet departures of the walkers for more than 1,000 years, simply allowed the matter to pass without comment. The walking continued, in the careful, capable hands of Mary Brennig. The village continued. The thing in the sea continued to come up at dusk, to be met, to go back down. The salt path continued, in the long, quiet way it had continued for more than 1,000 years, to be walked. May the walkers always come. May the meetings always hold. May the long, quiet work of standing at the edge of things, on behalf of those who do not know that the standing is being done, continue, in this village and in all the other quiet places like it, for as long as there is a world that needs them. Good night.